Hey everyone, how are you doing? It's Frank from Heritage, Ohio, and I'd like to welcome you to this week's webinar. It's part of our Profiles in Preservation Month webinar series, and I'm really excited because today we have Beth Johnson, the urban conservator with the City of Cincinnati, to talk about local governmental administration in the context of historic preservation. So I'm glad you all can join us today. A little bit about Heritage Ohio. Our mission, whoa, hey. Our mission is to help people save the places that matter, build community, and live better. We're active in advocacy, historic preservation work, and downtown revitalization throughout the state of Ohio. And so we do stuff like webinars and our 2019 Preservation Month photo contest. We've been doing this for about 10 years, and this is your opportunity to go online and vote for your favorite. If you go to our homepage, heritageohio.org, you can see right there in the middle of the screen there, click on that. You can vote for your favorite finalist for the Preservation Month photo contest. And one more item. The slides don't seem to be going forward. Oh, hey. So want to let you know that you're invited to join us for our May 29th webinar. That will be the final of our 5 Profiles in Preservation webinar series. Looking forward to that. We're going to have Lois Fisher and Kate Fisher talking about real estate development through the lens of historic preservation. And that is a week from today at 1 p.m. So just from a quick technical standpoint, if you happen to have any trouble as you're on the webinar viewing the presentation or listening to the audio, a lot of problems can be solved by just logging out and logging back in to the webinar software. Hopefully that works for you. If you are a longtime listener and have been involved with my webinars before, you know that I am cursed when it comes to webinars, but hopefully today's webinar goes off without a hitch. And not advancing, so it's the slides aren't advancing, so
They just did.
They did? Oh my gosh. Well, look at that. Oh, and now I'm back. Well, hey, I am really excited because we have Beth, as I was saying, the urban conservator with the City of Cincinnati, and Sarah Marsom with Young Ohio Preservationists and a Heritage Ohio trustee on the Heritage Ohio board. So what I will do at this point is turn it over to Beth and let Beth share with you a little bit about the ins and outs of local governmental administration. Beth, take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming and coming to listen to me and talk about historic preservation at a local level, at a local municipal level, and kind of my story of how I got there. So I'm going to kind of start with a little bit of my kind of background and history into how I decided to become a historic preservationist. So I actually made the decision when I was 12 years old that I wanted to be a historic preservationist, and that is not typically something that a 12-year-old would want to be or would even know what that is. And my life has kind of been a story of a lot of history, a lot of historic appreciation of my history. I spent my summers in the Colonial Triangle of Virginia. My dad grew up in Newport News, and his family has been in that area since Williamsburg. So I spent day camps at Williamsburg, Jamestown, Yorktown. I did archaeology as part of the day camp at Williamsburg and at Jamestown. So just kind of this history and having it a part of my childhood was a really big deal. And then when I was 12 years old, I went to Charleston with my family because we often took trips to kind of these historic destinations. And that kind of middle picture of me and my grandmother was actually we were on a trolley ride and they started talking about historic preservation and that's why Charleston is the way it is. And so I turned to my grandma and said to her, okay, that's what I want to do. My mother, being a college professor, wanted to know exactly what that means. Is there job opportunities in there? What sort of education do you get? So really early on, we started to look at what colleges, what sort of education, what sort of degrees I would need to go into historic preservation. So as I was going into high school, I was already very well aware of the colleges that I wanted to go to. And then just my family loves history and loves historic buildings. And so they just really fed into that desire. My grandmother, who was on the trolley with me, was a longtime member of the National Trust, and she arranged for me to have a private tour of East Vanderos Farmsworth House because she only lived a few miles from there, and just really had some amazing opportunities as I was younger, learning about historic preservation and learning what it meant and what routes I needed to go to. So as I was looking at schools, I was told early on by a extended family member in Virginia who actually also worked for Historic Williamsburg as their head of archaeology that I really needed to get my undergraduate degree in some sort of design related profession. So he said architecture, knowing that I would have to get a master's in historic preservation. So growing up in Dayton, Ohio, I'm very blessed that there's a lot of really great design schools here. There's obviously University of Cincinnati, University of Kentucky, Ohio State. Ultimately, I chose Ball State University. It was just a place that felt best to me. And one great thing about their program is that they call it the Common First Year Program. So you're accepted to the College of Architecture and Planning, and you then learn bases of urban planning, of architecture, and of landscape architecture. And then after your second full semester, you actually then at that point declare. And so very early on in my career at Ball State, talking to the professors and learning about what urban planning was, I really saw that urban planning was the route that I wanted to take and was the route that I wanted to pursue. So I actually declared urban planning. And just because of that program, I was actually able to get also a history degree. And part of the reason I chose Ball State is they also had this minor in historic preservation. So I could start to get my foundations in historic preservation. And a great thing about Ball State is it actually has some fairly close ties to Cornell through the preservation program. The director of the Cornell program, Michael Tomlin, actually started the Ball State program in historic preservation as well. So to me, that was kind of the natural progression of me, was to go to Cornell. And also the fact that Cornell's program was in a planning department made that a really good fit for me. And so that, for education wise, that's how I got to historic preservation. And as I continued to develop as a professional, I've always sought opportunities to expand my knowledge base through continuing education. And what I've come to realize, especially in the local government, is that you need to know a little about a lot. And so there's a lot of fields that you're going to touch. And so I've taken opportunities to learn about preservation trades and specifically window restoration, because as a local preservationist, I feel that is probably one of the biggest questions we get from homeowners. So learning about how to do that and being able to do it myself was a goal that I wanted to do. And then working closely with other organizations that have preservation as a goal as well, such as Renaissance Covington for Covington, Kentucky, which is just across the river. That is their Main Street program. And so that was an organization I worked closely with. And so understanding what the Main Street program is about, economic development, urban parks and all of that were ways for me to expand my education, expand my knowledge base, to be able to talk to different organizations and help understand where their mission is and where historic preservation fits in with their mission as well. And so when I graduated grad school, I pretty much only looked at government jobs. I didn't look in nonprofit. I pretty much only applied to governments. And part of that reason was that most of my internships through undergrad and through grad were in government agencies, were either the city zoning offices or metropolitan planning organizations. So like the Miami Valley Regional Planning Commission up in Dayton and the city of Beaver Creek were two organizations that I had worked with. And growing up in the military at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and having a lot of family that had been in the military or been in government growing up, it just felt like a very natural fit for me. I also liked that there were kind of very set rules. My mom would always joke growing up that as I was that kid that always wanted the rules to be followed, I had to read all the rules for all of the board games, that government work was definitely in my future. So the first job I took was in San Antonio, Texas, with their neighborhood planning department, and I actually was running the neighborhood conservation program. So San Antonio has possibly one of the, if not the strongest, local historic programs in the country. They've done an amazing job. Shannon, the person that's there now, has done amazing things with the program. And when I took the job in San Antonio, Ann McGlone was the director of the historic preservation department. However, I went into planning mostly because that was a good fit for me with my planning bachelor's, but also with the neighborhood conservation program. It was actually run by the planning department, not the preservation department. So I was there for about 18 months. And then I just really wanted to kind of get back to the Midwest, back to home. And so a job opened up in Covington, Kentucky. And I took that in 2007. I was their historic preservation officer, preservation planner. I think I probably had 3 different titles as they kind of did reorganizations over the years in Covington. But I was the preservationist for the city of Covington. I was there for 7 years, and I loved my time in Covington. Northern Kentucky is a great place, and a really strong preservation ethic in that city and in the citizens. After about 7 years, though, I knew that I wanted to have another challenge. While I would have loved to stay in the area at that point, there were no positions open. In Cincinnati, there are only 2 full-time municipal historic preservationists, Covington and Cincinnati. So I started looking elsewhere, and I was recruited to Austin, Texas, to work in their historic preservation office. And so I moved back to Texas, and then was there for just under a year, because about 6 months after I got there, the Cincinnati position opened, and I got a lot of calls asking if I was going to be applying for this position. So I pretty much jumped at the chance, because this is home to me. And so I was blessed to get the job, and then I came back to Cincinnati to be their urban conservator. And so as part of the route to getting to, with all of these different jobs, and with all my education, I've been very, very blessed to be surrounded by people that are really supportive, that have taught me a lot in the field. Obviously, my parents were the foundations for that. They were both public sector employees, with my mom being a professor at Sinclair University, my dad being in the military, and then became a middle school teacher as well. So for them, public service was a very, very important thing. And then early on in my career, through Ann McGlone with the city of San Antonio, she introduced me to the National Alliance for Preservation Commissions. And that organization and the people in the NAPC have been, I can't even express the amount of support and knowledge that they have given to me. Specifically, Dan Becker, who used to be the Raleigh planning director, preservationist in Raleigh. He's always been one of those people I can pick up the phone anytime and call. And so finding those people has been really, really important. And then the large picture is my professor and mentor from Ball State, Scott Truex, who really taught me the importance of in being in the public sector and being in planning, how important people are to the whole story. And so I'll get in a little bit about that, about my lessons in historic preservation. But with the foundation in urban planning, seeing that historic preservation is a tool and part of the entire system of a city was an extremely important foundation point for me from Scott. And then these three women, or these women on the bottom, Jean Shore, Jody Robinson, and Margot Worminski, have been three women here in Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky that have been indescribable in my career. Jody and Margot are both fellow historic preservationists who understand the craziness that can go on in local politics, but are always just really supportive and always the people that I can geek out with about historic preservation. And Jean Shore is actually an economic development professional. She runs the Catalytic Development Fund for Northern Kentucky, and she has also just taught me the importance of historic preservation as part of the entire story, but also being able to, in a way, dream with these historic buildings. If you are not aware of what the Catalytic Development Fund has been doing with rehabbing some amazing buildings that people never thought would be saved, they've done some amazing work. And so she's been a person that helps me understand how to dream big and make those dreams a reality with these buildings. So one of the big questions I get often is, what do I do every day? And so daily, I'm pretty much doing meetings, staff reports, permits, phone calls, and then long-term projects. So meetings with applicants and on cases, I meet with, mostly in this job in Cincinnati, architects and developers, some business owners and some individual homeowners, but with most of our activity being in over the Rhine, a lot of it is mostly developers and architects. And so we do a lot of what we call pre-application meetings, where we're meeting with them, looking at designs, looking at what they're proposing, giving them feedback, whether we think that it is something that we can support or not support, determining what would be able to go at a staff level, what would be able to be, or what would have to go to a board. And then also with this position here, I actually deal with all of the zoning for these properties as well. So just making sure that it meets the zoning code, that the uses are permitted, and if any other approvals need to go through the Historic Conservation Board for zoning relief, kind of outlining those as well. And so then the second part of that is obviously writing those staff reports to present to the Historic Conservation Board. As I said, I am also the zoning person for historic districts. And so we do deal a lot with zoning permits, and then obviously certificate of appropriateness coming through. And then always answering phone calls and emails as they come in. And then when those aren't being done, the long-term projects such as landmark designations, historic district designations, updating guidelines, the survey. And while I don't have as much time to do survey work as I would love, we have an amazing History Corps, AmeriCorps representative here in Cincinnati that's been doing our survey work. And so just touching base with them and making sure that they're getting what they need as well. And so so that's my day, my typical day. And then our year is kind of broken. It is really broken up with seasons. So the summer is actually getting into kind of my lighter season, because now everything is in construction. And so it's just basically project, continuing to work on the projects, quality control, engineering changes, change orders, making sure that we're on track with the survey that's ending at the end of the year. And then in Cincinnati in June and July, our city council is on break. And so it's kind of quiet, where we can get a lot of work done. So a lot of those long-term projects get done for me in the summer. So then beginning in the fall and over the winter is really our pre-construction approval. So that's where people start coming in to talk to us about plans, that come in to talk to us about the projects that they're doing, to be able to get ready to get on the agenda for the Historic Conservation Board. Most people want to have their approvals with the Historic Conservation Board, which is our our preservation commission. They want to get those done usually by late February, beginning of March, so they can get their construction permits in and get everything in hand to begin construction in spring. So then we're dealing with that. Over winter, we're also working, there's the historic tax credit and low-income housing tax credit applications are due, so we're working with applicants and helping them get everything they need from the city to get into the state. Our CLG grant, our programmatic agreement for our Section 106 reviews are due. So a lot of kind of administration stuff happens in the winter as well. And then spring is always defined by budget season, and that's just always a crazy time in local government, because I feel like every government I've worked with, the task that they do with budgets is like, okay, well, where can we cut? So it's always kind of a tense time figuring out what programs are going to be able to be funded. Will I be able to have an AmeriCorps representative, and that sort of stuff during budget season. And so some of my preservation rules to live by as a local historic preservationist or municipal preservationist is that, as I've stated before, historic preservation is really about planning. Most historic preservation offices are in a planning department. I'm actually in buildings and inspections because I obviously deal with a lot of permitting. However, my position was, prior to being here, was in the planning department, and I still work closely with them anytime they are doing neighborhood plans where historic preservation is an issue. I'm going to those meetings, talking to the neighborhoods about the different types of designations that they can pursue, what other routes are out there. Recently, we tried to look at doing neighborhood conservation districts in one neighborhood, and so I was really in on that, the ground floor of that discussion as well. And so for me, that is one of my biggest lessons that I've learned at the municipal government, is that we are one of the tools that cities need to use to help make sure that their future city is functioning and is the best at revitalization that they can actually do. And this is another one that I mentioned, is that historic preservation is about people. We obviously are all in this field because we love architecture, we love saving buildings, we love the history that it represents. However, if we're not saving them for people, what are we saving them for? And so we have to really understand that a building that is being used is the best preservation tool that you can have. And so making sure that buildings are being able to be used for people. So, working with ADA, making sure that economic development is part of the discussion to make sure that these buildings are getting uses that will be sustainable, and are uses that people need as well. And so people need to be part of the discussion. They need to be part of having the discussion of what the city's preservation ethic is. Do they want to be a Charleston? Do they want to be more of a Portland? Do they want to be something in between? Like, what sort of preservation are they looking for? So historic preservation is also about managing change. So as cities, we're obviously growing, and we're changing constantly. When I always use the example with Over the Rhine, when people tell me, they're like, I just want Over the Rhine to be exactly like it was in the 1890s during its heyday. And I was like, well, actually, you really don't, because there wasn't plumbing, there was overcrowding, people were dumping their laundry water in the streets, there were pigs running around the streets weren't paved, it was dirty. So I don't think any of us would want to give up our indoor plumbing. I don't think any of us would want to be living with 30 people in a 4-bedroom apartment. So we need to make sure that these buildings are changing to accommodate these uses. So indoor plumbing is a good thing. Making sure that we understand that we do live in a car society. While I love public transportation and I wish that every city would have as great a transportation network as Chicago, New York City, Boston, we just don't here in Cincinnati. And so understanding that you do have to take the car into consideration, and taking that as a part of the change that happens in a neighborhood is just part of the story of historic preservation. And then finally, historic preservation is not a silo, kind of as I touched on multiple times, that historic preservation needs to work with economic development. We need to work with the Department of Transportation Engineering. We have to work with the Port Authority, building inspections, planning, economic development, sewer, stormwater. Basically, when our buildings get redeveloped, we touch all of these different departments, and you can't work in a silo. You have to understand how the economic development department is working in a neighbor to make sure that they know about tax credits. You need to understand what the Department of Transportation Engineering Policy is. You have to work with ADA. So it's one of those, you really need to be able to work with everyone and know, at least touch base with where everyone is, and just be part of the entire story and the entire team, and not completely work by yourself. So I'm going to talk about, in each of the cities I've lived in, some of my favorite projects that will kind of show how varied you can get when you're in municipal governments, depending on the city that you're in as well. And so when I was down in San Antonio, the big project I worked on was this Tobin Hill neighborhood plan. So they were at the time that I was working with them, was the neighborhood conservation district that was wanting to move to a historic district. And so I worked with them, and one of the big things that they had in their neighborhood was this old brewery, and called Pearl Brewery, and it was a vacant site. A developer had bought it, but was really kind of figuring out what he wanted to do. And so through neighborhood charrettes and the neighborhood plan, we helped kind of spur the development plan for the Pearl Brewery. And so being able to go back and see that it's become this great mixed use neighborhood hub has shown that one big project can be a really big economic revitalization for an entire neighborhood. In Northern Kentucky, when I worked in Covington, we kind of had what we call the Northern Kentucky Restoration Group. And so it was a lot of collaboration in Northern Kentucky. One of the most amazing things about working in Covington was that we had 3 certified local governments all in a row. So there was Covington, Newport, and Bellevue. And so I got to work really closely with both Newport and Bellevue on a lot of different projects. And one of the things that we started to do was what we call the Northern Kentucky Video Series. And so we saw an opportunity that people love watching videos online, and that we can tell the story, but sometimes it's easier just to tell the story and have it out there in a very well-made professional format. And so we ended up making 2 videos while I was there, and they've made a couple more since I've left. And so one was starring Nick Clooney. We like to think that he's the famous Clooney, but he is George Clooney's dad. And he volunteered to be the narrator for our first video. And then we did one called Living History, which is all about the architecture. And so those were both really great opportunities to get people from the community involved, because Jody Robinson, who was my cohort in this, neither of us were in the videos. We made sure that the people that were telling the story were the people that were doing the work, the people that were living in the buildings, and people from the community, because for us, that was the important part, was that we're getting the community involved. And then Northern Kentucky Restoration Weekend. This was, again, another concept that we had on making sure that we're getting education out. And so we created basically a free conference. So this was always using certified local government funds that we were able to do this. And we created a conference where it now has 2 parts, one for professionals and then one for the homeowner. And so a lot of information is getting out there, such as how to research your home, how to work on wood windows, what is proper masonry methods, what is good roofing materials, pretty much anything that you can think of when you're rehabbing a historic building, and as a DIYer you would want to know, we try to provide that. And this is possibly my favorite one that I ever did when it comes to education, is the Covington coloring book. This was just kind of another one of those ideas, talking with someone, and there was an old kind of activity book from the 70s that we had pulled out of storage, and we're like, we should really do something to update this. And we ended up taking a survey of what people consider some of the most important buildings or landmarks within Covington, and we had a local artist draw all these up, and then I worked with high school students to write the histories and write this book. And so it became Color Covington, and it actually ended up spurring a program at Baker Hunt Cultural Center, and it was used in the schools as a education tool as well. And so it was just something that got a lot of life out of it, for not really a huge investment, either time or money wise. And so it was just a really fun project for us to work on. And then the final project that this is still going on, from when I was working in Covington, was the Bavarian Brewery. Traditionally, cities have, either historic landmarks or historic districts, and that is usually how you are able to prevent buildings from being demolished. And this was a very interesting case in that it had actually an urban renewal plan on it from the state of Kentucky, adopted by the city of Covington, that actually stated that the historic Bavarian Brewery couldn't be demolished. And so that is actually how we were able to save it. It ended up going to court, and luckily the county came in and bought it before the courts actually had to make a decision, and are turning it into the new county offices with an addition. And so it's just been a really great story of the community coming behind a building that is an icon in the city, and the politicians and the elected officials really listening to what the community wanted and trying to provide a way to make it happen. And then in Austin, this is just a great neighborhood called Aldridge Place that was a local historic district. And what lesson this taught me is that when I was in Austin, there were two different historic districts trying to get established. The Aldridge Place and Bluebonnet. Aldridge Place was really a citizen-led from the ground up that had a lot of support in the neighborhood. I think there's only one or two dissenting property owners. And so that one was able to get passed really easily. And just working with neighbors that were really excited and did really thorough work and were willing to put their boots to the ground and get out there was for me a big lesson in making sure that you have the community support for historic preservation. And this is a story that's still going on, our Terrace Plaza. So this is in Cincinnati, and so this has been one of my favorite buildings to work on and to fight for. This is, for those that don't know, this is a building that was built in 1948 by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. It was their first hotel, and is considered one of the most important, if not the most important, modernist building in Cincinnati. It is gone under a lot of different ownership. It currently is with some new owners, and we actually have a council member who has submitted a local historic landmark application. So that landmark application is still pending, and we are still actively working with the developers and the new owners to try to find a solution for this building to make sure that it gets saved. There had been previous proposals that wanted to basically cut windows all through this building and pretty much destroy the integrity entirely. So this has been a fun one because it's not a building that people look at and say, oh, well, that's historic in a city that has, one of the largest collection of Italianate buildings. This is not what people normally think of as historic preservation. So being able to really expand people's thoughts on what historic preservation is and what is important has been really interesting. And I've been very lucky to work with organizations like the AIA and Cincinnati Preservation Association, Cincinnati Preservation Collective to help educate people on why this building is important. And then finally, King Records. This is a building and a story that's extremely close to my heart. I work with a racial reconciliation organization in my off time in the city, and King Records is an extremely important building, an extremely important legacy. And so most people would look at this building and would think it's not pretty, it's why were we saving it? And the thing is, historic preservation isn't always about saving the pretty buildings, it's about saving the history. And so this building is where James Brown had recorded a lot. It was a building that has such an important legacy to people of color, to the Black community here in Cincinnati. This was an integrated record studio, integrated record production facility, starting off in the 1940s. And to have something that talks about integration and talks about equality that early on in Cincinnati's history, where Cincinnati has had a very storied past when it comes to race relations, is just kind of a beacon of hope for this. And so this building and its legacy means a lot to the community. And so the city actually bought this to save it from the wrecking ball. And it is locally landmarked. We are working on the National Register and hope to be submitting that soon. But we're still in the early planning phases of what exactly this looks like. So this is one where we have to dream big to see what is the end use and the end result that we want with this building. And so some of my words of wisdom. So as I've said, you have to know a lot about a little. Or sorry, that said that wrong. You have to know a little about a lot. Sorry. And so you're going to be more than a historic preservationist when you work for a local city, especially depending on the size of the city. When you're working for a smaller city, you will end up getting your fingers in a lot of different things. In larger cities, you might be able to be more focused, but you're going to have to do economic development. You're going to be a tour guide. You're going to be an inspector. You're going to end up knowing a lot more about building code than you ever thought you would. You're going to have to negotiate, sometimes design, paint color selector, advocate, educator. So there's a lot of different things that you're going to have to do as a historic preservationist. You have to learn from the losses and then move on. Not every case is going to go the way that you want it. Your board is a board of appointed officials. They aren't professional historic preservationists in general, and so the decisions aren't always going to be what you feel is the right decision, but it is the process, and it is the kind of the political process that your city or municipality has set up. And at the end of the day, be disappointed. The Denison Hotel is kind of the big disappointment for me in my career so far, that we lost the Denison Hotel. But it has actually taught me a lot about how to testify on stand, how to write really detailed reports that you know are going to be in court. It taught me a lot about the standard that we should have when it comes to economic hardship, and it set an extremely high standard for us. And so, you just can't dwell on those, because if you dwell on the losses and that's all that you concentrate on, you're not going to see all of the little wins that you have as well, and the big wins that you have. Partnerships are key. So I could have filled probably 4 or 5 slides with all of the types of people in partnerships that we have, but you're gonna have to work with other organizations, other groups, in order to get things done. As a city, you can only be part of the solution. There's going to be times where you're going to need like a port authority or a development fund or another sort of development organization to come in and save buildings. We have one organization called Over the Rhine, Adopt OTR, OTR Adopt, and they've actually worked really closely with our law department in coming and being a receiver on some of these historic buildings that the city then forecloses on. So that's been a great partnership for us. Obviously, Preservation Collective and Cincinnati Preservation Association are the advocates that can often say stuff that I can't. And then just the range of different programs and projects that you do, having these partnerships are probably one of the most important things for you as a local historic preservation officer. And then the preservationist's best friend is education and access. Making sure that people have access to your website, access to where the guidelines are, having different sort of education opportunities, whether it's windows or a preservation bike ride, having tours, are all important, because if people can get the information and they can take it back and do it themselves, especially when it comes to things like windows, that's going to be a huge advantage to making people think that historic preservation is not this pie in the sky thing, but it's something that they're able to do themselves, and it's really not as expensive as they think it is. And so kind of where do I go from here? So I've now been in Cincinnati for 3.5 years, and I don't plan on moving on. I love it here. To me, Cincinnati is home. I think that Cincinnati is an architectural gem that is just now being discovered. Traditionally, Cincinnati had not done a great job of promoting itself, but with the recent well, actually the decade-long so far redevelopment that we've been having of over the Rhine of downtown. We just had Union Terminal was finished, Music Hall. All of these things are now making Cincinnati this destination place that people are wanting to come to and are excited to come to. And so I'm just ecstatic to be part of that story. I love it here. We have our challenges. We're not perfect, but when I say that Cincinnati has everything I want in a city with the exception of good public transportation, that's really true. I love living in Cincinnati. It's home to me. Growing up in Dayton, this was always just a stone's throw away. And then also, while you don't think of Cincinnati as a mid-century modern, a place with a lot of mid-century modern, I also see moving Cincinnati in that direction with help of CF3, Cincinnati Preservation Association. Obviously, that's a focus on the state as well, is really trying to understand and expand the knowledge of historic preservation to some of our more modernist buildings as well. And so the picture here of the big yellow building that's actually my building. It was designed by a student of Frank Lloyd Wright's named Ben Dombar. And so that's a personal passion of mine, but also a passion that I have for the city. And I just see us hopefully expanding what we think historic preservation is here in Cincinnati. So that's my presentation. Sarah, I think you guys have questions now.
Hey, Beth.
Hey.
Hey, so that was very interesting.
Thank you.
So at this point, we have Sarah Marsom, and we will also encourage our attendees to ask any questions that you might have.
Hey, Beth, let's start with an easy question. Your position title is called an urban conservator. What's the difference between being an urban conservator and a historic preservation officer?
So in practice, really nothing. And I actually had that question when I moved here too. And so I sat down and talked with Judith, who was on the Historic Conservation Board at that time, and she had been with the Historic Conservation Board for a long time. So she actually helped establish the Historic Conservation Office back in the 70s, and they were very intentional about choosing the word historic conservation rather than preservation, because going kind of in the tradition of Europe, and that conservation is about managing change rather than preventing change. And while we all know that as historic preservationists, we don't prevent change, that was kind of the connotation, and that preservation is supposed to be keeping things as they are. So it was always that we wanted the city to constantly be a city that's lived in and be able to adapt to the times, but to manage it in a respectful manner.
I think that's an incredibly thoughtful perspective of thinking preservation from the broader context and how it impacts your community. So how do you see the future of historic preservation for local government trending? So for example, conservation districts or cultural districts, what are some trends that you see popping up?
So I definitely think that neighborhood conservation districts will be expanding, especially as we get into some of these neighborhoods that are maybe more mid 1900s, so 1930s, 40s, 50s. I see conservation districts because people definitely have they like the character of those, and that's kind of the main goal of these conservation districts. And people don't want the McMansions. They want to keep that quaint character of the neighborhoods. I also do think cultural districts, again, I know I mentioned San Antonio, but San Antonio has been doing some pretty fabulous things when it comes to cultural districts and what that means, and kind of, again, from the ground up, a lot of oral histories. And we started some of that here with the brewery district up in the northern part of Over the Rhine. We just actually had a cultural heritage tour start up where it's kind of on your iPhones and using technology to take people on a tour of different historic sites throughout that are associated with the beer and brewing history in Cincinnati. And so I definitely think, obviously, technology is part of this story, is using technology to our advantage to tell the story of cities, to make it more accessible and easily accessible to people. And I also think that, and I don't know if this is a trend or maybe my wish for historic preservation, is that I do feel that it needs to be more proactive. In general, we've tended to be very reactionary. So when a building gets threatened for demolition is when people start organizing. And so I think that being proactive and trying to visualize what you think is going to be important historically. So not waiting till it's, threatened, or waiting till maybe something is necessarily hits that 50-year mark, but starting to really look at what assets that your city or your community have, and understanding what their importance is, and what are ways that you can protect those and tell those stories.
As you're keeping up with trends and what's going on in local government, where do you go for continuing education? Do you have any specific books, websites, or conferences that you'd recommend our participants?
Yes. So when it comes to local government, historic preservation, to me, there is nothing better than the National Alliance for Preservation Commissions, because these are people that are doing what you do every single day. I love the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I love the programming that they put on, but that is much more geared towards nonprofits, advocacy, that sort of stuff, and they don't have to necessarily deal with the politics and kind of the processes that we do. Luckily, they always allow and encourage the National Alliance for Preservation Commission to have sessions there as well. But being able to go to these NAPC conferences are great. And then NAPC actually has a great program called CAMP, where they actually bring trainers to your local community to train your community about specific issues. And so if your community is really dealing hard with economic hardship, or say demolition by neglect, they can bring the speakers that have that best knowledge to come in and help your community where they're at, to bring them up to where they really should be.
That's all great. I went to my first NAPC conference last year, and I found it invaluable in learning what other areas are doing for design guidelines, or how they're forming districts, or how they're engaging the community. And I've also found, and I'll plug this, is the Historic Preservation Professionals group on Facebook. It's a great free resource to just throw questions out there and have 3,000 professionals, be able to hear your voice and give you feedback from their personal experiences. We have Ian Andrews asking a bit of advice as well. He's wondering, how can city staff better understand how to use small historic tax credit projects, or how small historic tax credits are possible? It's not always that 8-story high-rise downtown. So what would your advice be to Ian or anybody else wanting to do small historic tax credit projects in their community?
Yes, so I can really only talk about my experience with in Kentucky with Covington, and then Ohio. Texas didn't have a tax credit program when I was there, and my office didn't really deal with them too much there. So I can talk from those two perspectives. In Covington, we actually, that was kind of an issue that we were having, that most of our developers are not big developers. We have about 3 or 4 developers that really are doing the majority of the historic preservation work in Covington. And having them get tax credits was really hard because they're not these big projects that investors want to syndicate. So we actually just with one of the developers, we went out and just talked to different banks. And so now it's BBT, but at that time it was Bank of Kentucky, and then there is Heritage Bank of Northern Kentucky, I think were the two. And we actually just went and talked to the local bank president, or the highest person we could get to locally, and talk to them about this, and really looked at those small local banks as people that would then partner and invest in them. And so that was key. But then we also had these CDFIs. So in Cincinnati, we have the Cincinnati Development Fund, and Northern Kentucky was the Catalytic Development Fund, and having them on board was also a key to getting banks to syndicate. So those are kind of the two ways that I've helped experience getting smaller projects as part of the tax credit program.
That's great. I'd also recommend, attending one of the Heritage Ohio tax credit coffees that pop around the state. And we even have a wonderful Heritage Ohio board member who you're going to hear from in next week's webinar, who's used tax credits for small town projects. So definitely listen to Kate next week on next week's webinar. You've talked a bit, Beth, about your work in Kentucky and Texas and Ohio. What are some tools, or what are some things that you've experienced that are different in the other state that maybe you'd like to bring back here?
I would say the number one thing is the tax credit for homeowners. In Kentucky, that was one of the single most useful tools that we had. It was a minimum $20,000 investment from a homeowner to be eligible for the program, and it helped make a lot of people think that preservation was within reach for them. And it was such an important program, because so many times, especially when you're in residential districts where they're going to be homeowners, they're not going to be these income producing properties. They're like, well, what's the point for historic preservation for me? I can't get anything out of it. And while we know that's not true, there's the stable property values that your neighbor isn't going to go do something to screw up their house. It's going to affect your property value. There's a lot of other advantages. Being able to say to them, hey, we have a tax credit program that you would be able to take a part of, was extremely helpful. And yeah, so that's probably the single most important thing that I would love to bring to Ohio.
I would also love to see it as somebody fixing up their old home. So what other advice would you give to building owners or homeowners to help make the process of going through commission review as painless as possible, to help them understand why they're investing in their historic home?
So I always tell people that when their house is their biggest investment, and so it does get very, very personal. So that is one big difference I have noticed between my time in Covington to my time in Cincinnati. Is in Covington, I dealt mostly with homeowners, whereas in Cincinnati, I'm dealing mostly with developers and architects. And so for them, with architects and developers, I usually don't have to sell the why, because they knew that that's what they were buying into. For homeowners, sometimes it's a little bit harder. And for them, you ask them, well, why did you buy this home? And 9 times out of 10, it's the architecture. It's that they fell in love with the neighborhood. They fell in love with the building and these the historic detailing, these beautiful Queen Anne's, these beautiful Italianates. And so you tell them, we're like, well, you want that to be here 10 years from now. You don't want someone to come in and buy all of the rest of the houses on your street and make them go away. And of course they don't. And so kind of tugging on the heartstrings a little bit is why, and just telling them that you're actually helping them protect their investment, and then also explaining to them, because vinyl windows was always the issue that we dealt with the most. And so explaining to them that yes, rehabbing historic windows is harder than putting new vinyl windows in, but those windows have been there 100 years. Those vinyl windows are going to last, if you're lucky, 20. And Margot Warminski says my favorite line ever. She's like, they're called replacement windows for a reason. And so, just trying to explain to them that they need to look at the long-term costs and the long-term effects of the changes that they're making, not just that quick fix. And trying to explain to them that we're on their side, that we want to protect their building, protect their investment, protect their neighborhood. And usually that we were able to help them kind of get to the point that, okay, they're on board with all of this.
I love that Margot statement. I'm going to steal that.
Yeah.
Hopefully she's okay with it. So on a bit more of a nuts and bolts about your job, Cincinnati's a certified local government community and a CLG community. It's a program ran through the State Historic Preservation Office. What do you find to be some of the advantage of being a CLG community? Any pros that you do to sell somebody on becoming one?
So obviously the grant program is great because it actually gives you funding for projects. So as most cities, their budgets are always tight and they're always trying to find where to cut. So it's things that they think are like extras that they don't necessarily want to fund. And so being able to have the CLG where the money has to be used for projects or programs has been invaluable to make sure that we get surveys done, that we get National Register nominations done, that we get guidelines updated and rewritten. And to me, that has been pretty much a saving grace for us to be able to get some of these projects done. But it's actually also a really huge advantage for our developers and investors when they're trying to go for tax credits, because in Ohio, if you're a CLG and you are a local landmark for a CLG, you're able to apply for the tax credit. So you don't actually have to be listed on the National Register to apply for the state program in Ohio. And so that just most of the time the developers will go on and get the national listing so they can get the federal as well. But because the state is this competitive program where there are timelines, it's often the quicker way to get a local landmark to make sure that they can be eligible for within the time frame they want. And so that's been a huge advantage for us, especially in our central business district. We've had a lot of local landmarks listed specifically to start the tax credit process.
And that's a great tie back for the smaller communities as well, the smaller community tax credits that we talked about. It doesn't necessarily have to be on the National Register. Consider what your local options are to open up those funding opportunities.
Yeah.
I've got a bit more of a personal question for you. I'm wondering, so clearly you're a preservationist as your profession, but do you have an easy job leaving preservation at home, or are you a preservation 24/7 type person?
I always say preservation is a lifestyle, not a job. I love working with my hands. I've been taught early on in my career about the preservation trades and having some really amazing friends that were preservation contractors and developers. They've taught me a lot. So I love rehabbing my home that you see in the picture. I love rehabbing that, and I love kind of getting my hands dirty. And so I'm always, doing that sort of work when I'm outside of work. But I love touring historic buildings. I love going to historic cities for vacation. So I'm able to leave my job at work where I'm not doing staff reports when I get home in the evening or stressing about the politics or any of that stuff. But to me, historic preservation is my life and is my passion. And so I'm always, trying to find great historic destinations. My mom hates driving with me because she says I don't watch the road. I just look at the buildings. So to me, it's just part of who I am and part of my life.
All right. So give us one not to miss travel tip. What is one destination we should try to go to this summer?
Okay. I was like, if you're saying this summer, well, of course, Cincinnati. you need to come here to Cincinnati. So actually, I know I said it before. So the Brewery Heritage Trail here in Cincinnati has just recently been launched, and it is really, really cool. There's some really, really cool buildings and things on that tour. They've done a lot of really awesome work with the history and the app that they have, and so to me, that is definitely a not to miss if you are down here in Cincinnati. And then also, Union Terminal just started their fountains up again. So if you've never been to Union Terminal, it is one of the prettiest buildings that you'll ever go to. It is absolutely amazing. And then you should come down and stay at the Netherlands Hotel and see one of the best Art Deco hotels that you've ever seen as well.
I love Union Terminal as well. I got an amazing hard hat tour of there not too long ago in the middle of the renovations, and I think that's probably one of the best buildings in Ohio. So definitely that should be on your summer list. And that's a great place to take kids if you're looking to foster appreciation for the past and youth, because there's a lot of great fun interactive exhibits there. Which kind of brings me to, you clearly found your passion early on in life, earlier than I'd say most people working in preservation, and it's really amazing. So what kind of advice would you give to people working in local government who might want to be fostering the next generation of community leaders in the preservation field? Would it be, suggesting a specific college program? Like, would you suggest definitely go look at Ball State, or maybe it's something that the government could put on and engage youth? Maybe it's having a high schooler on a local commission. I don't know. What kind of suggestions would you have about fostering the next generation of preservationists?
Well, so first and foremost, I really think that having historic preservationists work with their local planners is key. Here in Cincinnati, our APA does this Planners Day in School. And so I try to participate in that every year because, one, most kids have never heard of historic preservation, but also most kids have never heard of urban planning as well. And for me, getting that foundation with my undergraduate in urban planning was possibly the most important thing I did for preparing to go into local government. And so working with the planners on, if you have a local organization that does the Planners Day in School, that is really important. But I'm actually invited quite a bit to high schools to talk about historic preservation, because history teachers, they obviously want to foster kids and encourage kids to go into history, but they're like, what are they going to do? Be a history teacher or work at a museum? And to understand that there are a lot of other routes out there for people with history degrees is really, really important. And so I talk to probably 3 or 4 high school history classes a year about historic preservation and what I do and how I use history in my life. And so I just really think getting out there and talking to the next generation is key. I enjoy talking to the high school students. They definitely have that. They're not jaded yet on the world, and that they have that attitude that they can go do anything. And so introducing them to what historic preservation is, and that is actually a very viable option, and that yes, you can make a very comfortable life working in historic preservation is really important. And then just, the one, I don't want to say it's unfortunate, but pretty much any government job in historic preservation, you pretty much need to have a master's degree in. And so I think that goes working at the state, federal government, or local government in general. They're really looking for that master's degree. And so encouraging them to go into, whether it is undergraduate in history or undergraduate in urban planning, public policy, governmental affairs, especially if they want to go into local government, having some sort of foundation and still being able to either get a history minor, historic preservation minor. UC has a historic preservation certificate program. So just kind of looking at their options to see where they can go. And then there's some programs like Ball State, after I left, I think created a 5-year program where you would get like an undergraduate in urban planning and then 1 year historic preservation. masters. So, looking at what options there are, so you, again, aren't going to school for, 6 years, 6, 7 years, to be able to get a master's.
That's great. And I know Ball State even just launched a 12-month master's program as well, which is a really great way to think about saving some cash as you want to further your education.
Yeah.
So has there been anything that we missed? I feel like you've talked about some highlights of your career, some tough points with the Denison. Is there anything that we've missed that you'd like to make sure our listeners know about?
I don't think so, other than just, again, promoting Cincinnati. We're a really cool place to come.
Well, how can people reach you, or how's it best to stay in touch with you?
So you can definitely email me. My email is beth.johnson@cincinnati-oh.gov. You can also Google Beth Johnson Cincinnati, and I should come up. So that's usually the easiest way. I would say call me, but I will be honest, phone calls are harder for me to return than emails. And then actually I'm also on Instagram at Preservation Girl, is my handle, and I tend to post a lot of historic preservation, but you'll also lots of pictures of my dogs too. So if you like preservation and dogs, it's definitely a good Instagram to follow.
Well, maybe you'll launch the campaign that I want to see. I want to see pups for preservation as a hashtag. Just pictures of cute dogs in front of old buildings. That's all I want.
That I can start. One of the things that I actually have kept meaning, so I don't know if anyone from Preservation Collective is on here, but I want to do a preservation pub crawl. So where there's obviously historic buildings, puppies, and pubs. So I would like to work with them to get that, because I think people that love dogs are good people, and so are people that love historic buildings. So they kind of go hand in hand.
Well, definitely let us know when you're hosting that event, and we'll share it through the Heritage Ohio newsletter. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us today, Beth.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you guys for having me.
That's been great. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. One quick reminder before we leave you, join us next Wednesday at 1 p.m. It's our final Profiles in Preservation webinar. We look forward to speaking with Lois and Kate Fisher on real estate development. Everyone out there, enjoy the rest of your day, enjoy your preservation month, and we will see you soon.